I was standing on my front lawn on Cedar Ridge Drive when the first police cruiser turned the corner, lights flashing against the neat rows of houses. Then a second one followed. The whole street froze, curtains shifted, blinds cracked open, phones came up fast. In a neighborhood like Maple Hollow, 2 cruisers meant someone had done something very wrong, and everyone assumed that someone was me. Behind the officers stood Linda Whitaker, the HOA head, arms folded tight across her chest, chin raised like she had already won. She spoke loudly, clearly enough for half the block to hear, telling the cops I was refusing HOA compliance, harassing the board, and illegally altering community property. She didn't look at me once. She didn't have to. This was her moment. One of the officers stepped forward and asked for my name. I gave it calmly. Then I said the sentence that stopped everything cold. I don't answer to this HOA, and neither does this block. Linda laughed. A sharp, confident sound. Neighbors whispered. The officers exchanged a look. That's when I told them the truth. The HOA hadn't just been fining and threatening the wrong homeowner. They had just called the police on the legal owner of every piece of land they were standing on. And they had no idea what they'd just started. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I moved to Maple Hollow, I wasn't chasing drama or power. I wanted quiet, space, a place where nobody knocked on my door to tell me how tall my grass could be or what color my shutters had to stay forever. I had spent years saving, watching county listings, waiting for the right opportunity. When a modest home on Cedar Ridge Drive appeared in a quiet county sale, I dug into it like I do with everything important. The listing was clear. No active HOA governance attached to the parcel. Clean title. No outstanding liens. No covenants recorded against the lot. That detail mattered more to me than the price. Cedar Ridge Drive looked like every other planned neighborhood on the surface. Short street, fresh pavement, uniform mailboxes, trim lawns that all seemed to end at the same exact line. If you didn't know better, you would assume the HOA owned every inch of it. Most people did. What they didn't know was that the street had a strange past. Years earlier, the original developer had gone under halfway through expansion. Paperwork stalled. Parcels were left in limbo. Some filings were never completed. Some transfers never recorded. The neighborhood kept growing anyway, and no one ever stopped to ask whether the authority enforcing rules actually had the legal ground to stand on. That vacuum was filled by Linda Whitaker. Linda didn't run the HOA like a volunteer organization. She ran it like a private kingdom. Everything was about standards and a mage, but underneath it was fear. Violation letters appeared fast and often. Fines stacked up over tiny details. A porch chair angled the wrong way. A trash bin visible for too long. A wreath left up past an approved season. Every letter sounded polite on the surface, but the message underneath was always the same: comply or pay. Her enforcer was Todd Mallory. Todd didn't talk much. He didn't have to. He drove the neighborhood slowly, windows down, phone always in his hand. Photos were his weapon. He documented everything like evidence in an investigation. People learned to wave at him nervously or turn their backs when he rolled by. Nobody wanted to be his next folder. I wanted no part of any of it. For the first few weeks, I stayed invisible. I unpacked quietly. I waved but didn't linger. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't comment in neighborhood emails. I kept my head down and focused on settling in. From my perspective, if I didn't draw attention, I wouldn't become a target. That's how people survive under bad authority. You don't challenge it, you avoid it. That illusion lasted exactly 1 month. The first violation letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly and slid halfway into my mailbox like a threat that didn't want witnesses. It cited unauthorized overnight parking. My truck had been parked in my own driveway, not blocking a sidewalk, not on the street, on my property. The letter warned that continued noncompliance would result in escalating fines. I wasn't angry yet. I was curious. I drafted a polite response. Calm, professional, no accusations. I attached a copy of my recorded deed and the county map showing my parcel boundaries. I highlighted the section confirming that my lot was outside active HOA jurisdiction. I thanked them for their time and assumed the issue was a simple mistake. That was my first real mistake. Linda didn't respond with an apology. She responded with authority. She claimed the HOA had historic enforcement over the area. She referenced community consistency and shared frontage. None of it was law. None of it cited a recorded covenant. It was power language. The kind that works only when no one pushes back. A second letter followed. Then a fine notice. Todd's car started slowing down in front of my house more often. Neighbors stopped chatting with me as easily. I could feel it shifting, the quiet pressure, the unspoken message that I had somehow become a problem. I replied again, firmer this time. Same documents, same proof, same calm tone. That's when the HOA doubled down. The fines increased. The language hardened. The friendliness disappeared. Linda stopped pretending it was a misunderstanding. In her world, authority didn't come from paperwork. It came from obedience. And by refusing to fall in line, I wasn't just breaking a rule. I was challenging control. What she didn't realize yet was that I wasn't arguing opinions. I was standing on facts. And facts don't get tired. They don't get emotional. They don't back down just because someone with a clipboard says so. The moment the HOA chose escalation over verification, the situation stopped being about a parked truck. It became about who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. Once Linda decided I wasn't going to fall in line, everything shifted. The HOA stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding and started treating it like a rebellion that needed to be crushed. The violation letters didn't slow down. They multiplied. What began as a single warning turned into a steady stream of envelopes, each one more aggressive than the last. Fines appeared where warnings used to be. Deadlines shortened. The tone hardened. I watched the language change first. Words like please and reminder disappeared. In their place came phrases like final notice, will result in enforcement, and failure to comply. The amounts climbed fast. What started as small penalties doubled, then tripled, stacked on top of one another as if pressure alone could rewrite the law. Then came the threats. Linda sent an email stating that continued noncompliance could result in liens, towing, and further legal action. No explanation of what rule I had broken, no citation of authority, just consequences listed like a menu. It was intimidation dressed up as procedure. A few days later, my name appeared on the HOA bulletin. Non-compliant property on Cedar Ridge Drive. Repeated refusal to cooperate with the board. Hostile behavior toward HOA representatives. Those words spread fast. Group emails went out. Screenshots circulated. I became a warning story, the example Linda wanted everyone else to see. If she could isolate me, she could scare the rest of the neighborhood back into obedience. According to Linda, my property set a bad precedent. She wrote that allowing one homeowner to ignore HOA rules would undermine community standards. What she never addressed was the simple fact that I wasn't under those rules to begin with. Precedent didn't scare her. Losing control did. Todd took on a new level of interest in my house. His slow drives became scheduled. Same time, same angle. I would look up from my window and see him standing at the curb, phone raised, documenting my driveway, my porch, my lawn. He never spoke. He never waved. He just recorded. It felt less like inspections and more like surveillance. Neighbors started approaching me quietly, not in public, not where Todd or Linda might see. One woman caught me while I was checking the mail and whispered, "Be careful. Once Linda targets someone, she never stops." Another neighbor admitted they had paid fines they didn't believe were valid because fighting back only made things worse. A man down the street told me he'd tried once and ended up with daily citations until he gave in. That's when I realized fear was the real enforcement tool. I tried one last time to de-escalate. I sent certified letters so there would be no dispute about receipt. I attached county maps again, this time stamped and signed. I quoted the relevant sections. I requested mediation. I asked for a formal review. I made it clear I was not hostile, not uncooperative, just unwilling to accept authority that didn't legally apply. Linda's response came back short. No greeting, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the documents. "We decide what applies here." That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. This was never about a truck, or a driveway, or neighborhood harmony. It wasn't even about rules. Rules are written. They're defined. They can be verified. This was about control. Linda believed the HOA's power came from repetition and fear, not law. From people being too tired, too intimidated, or too unsure to push back. She believed that if she said something loudly enough, long enough, it became true. Standing there reading that line, I understood something important. If I kept trying to reason with her, I would lose. Not because I was wrong, but because reason only works when both sides respect limits. Linda didn't respect limits. So I stopped trying to convince her, and I started preparing to prove her wrong. After that last email from Linda, I stopped responding altogether. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood that arguing was exactly what she wanted. Arguments create noise. Noise creates confusion. And confusion is where people like her operate best. If I was going to end this, I needed clarity, not volume. So I went back to the county. I started where all real authority lives: recorded documents, deeds, maps, filings that don't care who shouts the loudest. I pulled every public record tied to Cedar Ridge Drive going back years. Old plats, developer filings, amendments that were proposed but never finalized. That's when the pattern emerged. Cedar Ridge Drive was never legally transferred to the HOA. The original developer had planned to fold the street into the association during a later expansion phase. That phase never happened. The company dissolved before final submission. The paperwork stalled, then vanished into administrative limbo. The homes were built. People moved in. The HOA stepped in and started acting like ownership had magically transferred just because enough time had passed. But time does not create authority. The streets themselves were never deeded to the HOA. The green buffer behind the homes was never assigned. The utility easements were still tied to the original developer's entity, which no longer existed. Several undeveloped parcels on the block had no active owner at all. They were effectively abandoned. And yet, for years, the HOA had been collecting dues, issuing fines, and enforcing rules as if they owned every inch of it. I didn't react. I verified. I spoke with a county land clerk who had been there long enough to remember the original filings. She walked me through the records slowly, carefully, confirming what I was already seeing. No transfer, no amendment, no legal handoff. She shook her head and said, "This happens more than people think. Most folks never check." Next, I sat down with an independent property attorney. Not someone tied to the HOA, not someone who thrived on drama, just someone who read documents for a living and told the truth. He confirmed it in plain language. The HOA had no legal ownership of Cedar Ridge Drive. Their authority was assumed, not recorded. An assumption doesn't hold up when challenged. What made it worse was the money. The HOA had been collecting dues and imposing penalties tied to maintenance and enforcement of land it didn't own. That wasn't just overreach. That was liability. Real liability. The kind that doesn't go away quietly once someone notices. That should have been enough to confront them. But then I found something bigger. As I reviewed tax records and foreclosure notices, I noticed a strange pattern. Multiple parcels along the block were delinquent. No active tax payments. No listed contact. Some were still registered to the defunct developer's name. Others were simply unclaimed. These weren't small scraps of land either. They included buffer zones, access strips, and pieces of property the HOA relied on for signage, utilities, and shared space. In other words, the foundation of their control wasn't just weak. It was empty. At that point, I had a choice. I could march into an HOA meeting with documents and demand they stop. I could threaten legal action. I could escalate publicly and force a confrontation. Or I could let the law speak for itself. I chose the quieter option. I started attending county auctions. I didn't announce it. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even park near the front. Most of the parcels had no competition. No one else wanted land that came with paperwork and history. To me, that history was the value. One by one, I purchased the delinquent lots, cleanly, legally, recorded every deed the same day. Each acquisition filled in another gap in the map, the buffer, the access strips, the undeveloped land the HOA assumed was theirs because no one had ever corrected them. I kept my head down and my records organized. The HOA kept escalating, completely unaware that every letter they sent me was being added to a growing folder labeled evidence. Every fine, every threat, every public accusation. They believed they were tightening their grip. In reality, they were building my case. I never confronted Linda. I never corrected Todd. I never posted in the group emails. Silence unnerved them more than resistance. They mistook it for weakness. What they didn't know was that the ground beneath their authority was already changing hands. By the time they realized something was wrong, the turning point had already passed. They just hadn't felt it yet. The county auctions were nothing like people imagine. No fast, talking bidders. No dramatic pauses. No tension in the room. Most days it was just a handful of people sitting on metal chairs, flipping through packets, waiting for their item to be called. That was part of what made it so effective. Nobody was paying attention to Cedar Ridge Drive because nobody thought it mattered. I did. The first parcel was one of the undeveloped buffer lots behind the homes. Overgrown, forgotten. The HOA treated it like common space, even though it had never been transferred to them. When the auctioneer called it, there were no competing bids. I raised my hand once. That was it. Clean sale. Recorded deed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't rush. I went home, filed the paperwork, and added it to the growing folder on my desk. The next auction brought the second buffer lot. Same result. No competition. Same quiet process. Another deed recorded. Another line filled in on the map I kept updating. I could see the picture forming now. Not just ownership, but continuity. Control of access. Control of space the HOA relied on without ever proving it was theirs. The roadway parcel came next. That one surprised even me. Cedar Ridge Drive itself, the strip of pavement everyone assumed belonged to the HOA, was still registered to the dissolved developer. No active owner. Years of unpaid taxes. The HOA had been maintaining it, citing it in rules, threatening towing on it, all without ever owning it. Again, no competition. I placed the bid. I won. The road beneath every house on the block was now legally mine. I remember sitting in my car afterward, hands on the steering wheel, not feeling triumphant so much as stunned by how fragile authority can be when no one checks the foundation. The HOA had ruled this street for years on nothing more than assumption. The utility easement land followed. Narrow strips most people would never notice. But those strips mattered. They carried lines. They connected parcels. They were part of how the HOA justified access and enforcement. Each one was acquired the same way, quietly, legally, recorded without fanfare. The shared green strip behind the homes was last. The space where HOA signs were planted. The area cited in newsletters as community maintained. The land they used as proof of presence. That one took a little longer, but when it came up, the result was the same. By then, I owned it all. Not just my home, not just a few forgotten lots. The entire block beneath the HOA's authority. The land their signs stood on. The road their enforcement letters referenced. The buffers they claimed responsibility for. Piece by piece, the illusion collapsed into something measurable and real. I documented everything. Deeds, tax receipts, maps. I had certified copies, digital backups, and time-stamped records. Nothing was left to interpretation. If anyone questioned it, the answer would be paper, not opinion. Through all of this, the HOA had no idea. They were too busy escalating. Violation letters kept coming. Fines stacked higher. Todd's photos continued. Linda's emails grew sharper, more personal. She accused me of being disruptive, of undermining the community, of refusing to cooperate. The irony was almost painful. The more they tried to exert control, the less they actually had. I never responded. Silence, to people like Linda, feels like disrespect. She took it personally. I could see it in the language she used, the way my name was singled out in emails. She wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was trying to make an example. That's when she made her fatal mistake. Instead of checking records, instead of consulting an attorney, instead of pausing to verify authority, she called the police. She reported me for refusing HOA compliance, for interfering with community operations, for altering property without permission. She framed it as defiance, as obstruction, as something that required immediate attention. And when the cruisers turned onto Cedar Ridge Drive with their lights flashing, she believed she was about to put me in my place. What she didn't realize was that by involving law enforcement, she had moved the conflict out of her imaginary rulebook and into the real world. A world where ownership is not decided by clipboards. A world where authority comes from records. And a world where every piece of land beneath her feet already belonged to me. The officers didn't rush me. They didn't raise their voices. They did what professionals do when they realize a situation isn't as simple as it was presented. One of them asked Linda to explain the issue again, this time slowly. She repeated her claims with confidence, saying I was refusing HOA compliance, interfering with community operations, and altering property that didn't belong to me. She spoke like she was reading from a script she'd practiced in her head all morning. When it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I reached into the folder I had brought outside with me and asked the officer one simple question. Do you want to see the records? That changed the tone immediately. I handed over the first document, my recorded deed. Then the next. Then the county boundary map, clearly marked and certified. I pointed out where Cedar Ridge Drive ended on the HOA's jurisdiction line. I showed them the parcels beneath the roadway, the buffer lots, the easements, all legally transferred and recorded in my name. I explained, calmly and clearly, that the HOA had been enforcing rules, collecting fines, and threatening penalties on land it did not own and never legally controlled. The officers took their time. They stepped away to review everything together. Papers were compared. Radios went quiet. Linda's confidence started to crack. One of the officers came back first and asked her a question she clearly hadn't prepared for. "Ma'am, can you show us documentation that the HOA owns this property?" Linda froze. She laughed nervously and said the HOA had always controlled the area. She talked about tradition, precedent, and community standards. The officer nodded, then asked again, more firmly, "I need recorded proof." She didn't have it. As the realization settled in, the entire mood shifted. What had started as an enforcement call turned into something else entirely. The officers explained, calmly but clearly, that HOA rules are civil matters, and that law enforcement cannot be used to intimidate or pressure a landowner, especially when ownership is documented. One of them mentioned that filing false reports could have consequences. That's when the neighbors started speaking up. At first, it was quiet. A man across the street admitted he'd been fined for things he didn't believe were violations. A woman said she'd paid penalties just to avoid trouble. Someone else asked out loud whether the HOA had ever actually shown proof of ownership to anyone. The fear that had kept everyone silent started to loosen its grip. Linda could feel it slipping. She stepped forward and raised her voice, accusing me of manipulating records. She said the deeds had to be fraudulent. She claimed I was trying to take over the neighborhood. The words came fast now, desperate, unfiltered. She pointed at me and told the officers I was committing fraud. That accusation was the moment everything ended for her. Fraud is not a casual word. The officers stopped her immediately and asked if she had evidence. Not suspicion, not belief, evidence. She had none. She tried to walk it back, but it was too late. The accusation was on record now. One officer turned to me and asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint regarding harassment and misuse of law enforcement. I told him I wanted the situation documented. That was enough. They warned Linda directly. No more calls without cause. No more intimidation. No more enforcement on property she could not prove she owned. They explained that continuing this behavior could lead to legal consequences for the HOA and for her personally. By the time the cruisers pulled away, Linda wasn't standing tall anymore. She was quiet, pale, clutching her clipboard like it was the last thing anchoring her to authority. The street felt different after that. Lighter. People stayed outside longer. Conversations started where there had only been silence before. The fear was gone, replaced by something new, clarity, and Linda knew it. She hadn't just lost control of the moment. She had exposed herself in front of the very people she ruled through intimidation. By calling the cops, she hadn't asserted power. She had handed it away. What she didn't understand yet was that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the consequences she could no longer avoid. The warning from the police didn't come with flashing lights or raised voices. It came quietly, which made it far more serious. One of the officers pulled Linda aside and explained, calmly but firmly, that calling law enforcement under false pretenses was not something to take lightly. Using the police as a tool to intimidate a homeowner, especially one with documented ownership, crossed a line. If it happened again, it would not end with a conversation on the lawn. That alone rattled her. But it didn't stop there. Within days, the county reached out. Not to me. A formal inquiry had been opened into the association's authority, its property claims and its collection of dues. The paperwork I had presented hadn't just shut down a police call. It had triggered a paper trail that the county could not ignore. Once public records were questioned, the system moved on its own. The HOA called an emergency meeting. It was scheduled fast, announced with urgency, and framed as a clarification session. The room was packed. People who had never attended a meeting before showed up early. The atmosphere felt different. There was no casual chatter, no sense of routine. Everyone knew something was about to break. I arrived with copies of everything. Deeds, notices, correspondence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and stated facts. Cedar Ridge Drive was not under HOA authority. The roadway, buffers, and shared spaces were not owned by the association. The dues collected for those areas were legally questionable. The enforcement actions tied to them exposed the board to real liability. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply placed the documents on the table and let them speak. The room went quiet. One board member asked Linda if this was true. She tried to deflect, talking about long-standing practice and assumed control. Another member asked for proof of ownership. She had none. Someone else asked whether an attorney had ever reviewed the boundary filings. That question landed hard. Todd stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He said he had joined the board to help with maintenance and organization, not to intimidate neighbors or risk legal trouble. He admitted he had raised concerns privately before and been told not to question authority. Then he resigned on the spot. He set his keys on the table and walked out without another word. That was the moment the room shifted. Once Todd left, the rest of the board stopped protecting Linda. Questions turned sharper. Why hadn't records been verified? Why were fines being issued without proof of jurisdiction? Why were police called without evidence? One member openly stated they felt missiled. Another said they would not be personally liable for decisions they hadn't fully understood. Linda tried to regain control. She raised her voice. She accused me of manipulating the situation. She claimed I was exploiting technicalities. But the words no longer carried weight. The spell was broken. Fear had been replaced by clarity, and clarity doesn't bend easily. A vote was called to suspend enforcement actions immediately. It passed. Another vote followed to freeze dues collection related to Cedar Ridge Drive pending the county investigation. That passed too. By the end of the meeting, Linda was isolated, no allies, no authority, just a clipboard full of rules that no longer applied. She left early, avoiding eye contact. Her power evaporated not through confrontation, but exposure. Over the next weeks, the HOA unraveled quickly. Board members resigned one by one. Internal emails surfaced showing deliberate decisions to pressure homeowners into compliance rather than verify authority. The county investigation expanded. Refunds were discussed. Attorneys were consulted. The HOA didn't collapse because I attacked it. It collapsed because it was hollow. It had relied on fear instead of facts, assumption instead of ownership, intimidation instead of law. The moment those things were questioned, there was nothing holding it together. By the time the county finalized its findings, Cedar Ridge Drive was formally removed from HOA control. The board restructured under strict limitations, stripped of enforcement power they never should have had. Linda disappeared from leadership entirely. Poetic justice didn't come in the form of punishment or revenge. It came in the form of truth doing what truth always does when it's finally seen. It ended the lie. Once the county completed its review, the outcome was unavoidable. The HOA formally dissolved its authority over Cedar Ridge Drive. Not paused, not under reconsideration, removed. The language in the notice was precise and final. The association had no legal jurisdiction over the roadway, the buffers, or the shared land it had claimed for years. From that moment on, Cedar Ridge Drive no longer existed on the HOA's enforcement map. Refunds followed. Not immediately, and not without resistance, but they came. Fines that had been collected under false authority were returned. Some neighbors received checks they never expected to see again. Others received apologies they had waited years to hear, though they came quietly and without ceremony. Public records were amended. County maps were corrected. The fiction that had governed the block finally gave way to documented reality. The change in the neighborhood was almost immediate. People lingered outside again. Conversations happened in driveways instead of behind closed doors. Kids played without parents watching the street for Todd's car. Mailboxes became slightly different from one another. Lawns didn't look identical anymore, and somehow that made the place feel alive for the first time. The fear was gone, and with it went the constant pressure to perform compliance. A few people approached me carefully, unsure of what would happen next. They wanted to know if I planned to enforce new rules, raise rents, or start making demands of my own. After all, on paper, I owned the land beneath much of the block. From the outside, it might have looked like I had simply replaced one authority with another. I didn't. I made it clear to everyone that nothing was changing. I wasn't evicting anyone. I wasn't increasing rents. I wasn't creating a new set of rules to follow. The roads stayed open. The green spaces stayed shared. Utilities continued uninterrupted. Life went on exactly as it had before, minus the fear. That decision confused some people. Control-obsessed systems expect retaliation. They expect power to be used the same way it always has been. When it isn't, they don't know how to respond. By doing nothing, by refusing to replace intimidation with another form of authority, I stripped the HOA's obsession of its final justification. There was nothing left to fight. The board attempted to save face, issuing a vague statement about organizational restructuring. It rang hollow. Everyone knew what had really happened. The clipboard tyranny had collapsed under its own weight, undone not by rebellion, but by restraint. Linda never returned to another meeting. Her name quietly disappeared from emails and documents. People said she moved not long after, but no one seemed interested in confirming it. Her absence spoke louder than any announcement. Cedar Ridge Drive settled into something simple. Neighbors helped each other again. People waved without fear of being watched. When issues came up, they were handled face to face, not through warning letters. The neighborhood didn't fall into chaos without the HOA. It found balance, and that, more than any confrontation or legal victory, felt like the real win. I hadn't set out to control anything. I just wanted peace. In the end, the most powerful response to years of intimidation was to deny it the reaction it craved. No revenge, no replacement tyranny, no victory speeches. Just people living their lives without someone standing over them with a clipboard. That quiet freedom was the final insult to a system built entirely on control. Looking back on everything that happened, the lesson is simpler than it first appears. Power only works when people are afraid to question it. As long as no one checks the paperwork, authority can pretend to be permanent. But the moment someone stops arguing and starts verifying, the illusion cracks. Maps matter. Records matter. Ownership matters. Not because they're exciting, but because they're honest. They don't bend to pressure. They don't care who raises their voice or who has the loudest title. They just sit there, waiting for someone to look closely enough. The HOA didn't lose because I outshouted them. I never raised my voice. I didn't win because I embarrassed anyone or forced some dramatic showdown. They lost because I was prepared. Because I checked what everyone else assumed. Because I let facts do the work instead of emotions. Cedar Ridge Drive feels different now. Peaceful in a way it never really was before. There are no warning signs planted in the grass, no envelopes sliding into mailboxes, no slow patrols circling the block. People talk again. Kids ride their bikes without being watched. Neighbors solve problems by knocking on doors instead of filing complaints. It's just a neighborhood now. Nothing more. Nothing less. And that's how it should have been all along. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?